On reprend. Alors, nous avons deux témoins.
We'll start again. We have two witnesses. We have Eric Husher, who is appearing
from the UN, head of UNEP Finance Initiative. We also have from the OECD, Mr. Hugh Miller, who's an analyst. We will start with Mr. Usher. You have 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to address the committee. So as presented, I'm with the UN. I'm with the part of the UN that works with the finance sector to develop norms for sustainable finance, responsible investment. Of most relevance to this session is that we convene several of the net zero alliances, including the Net Zero Banking Alliance and the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which many Canadian financial institutions have signed on to as a means of setting credible science-based net zero targets. Now, as well documented by the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision and many others, climate change poses risk to the financial system. Now, just last month, the Basel Committee formally incorporated climate risks into its core principles, which set out the overarching standards for regulations to keep the global financial system stable. So it's increasingly acknowledged that misalignment of capital flows with the global climate objectives may result in short, medium, and long-term financial risks for financial institutions individually, as well as affect financial stability overall. The financial industry is largely aware of these risks. In fact, voluntary industry action has been a key driver of sustainable finance around the world, including in Canada, reflected in many financial institutions integrating sustainability considerations into their operations. For example, they identify sustainability as a key priority within their business strategy and reflect this in their governance and compensation policies. They establish systems to analyze climate risks and the impact of their financing. They've begun making sustainability disclosures, and many are setting net zero targets on a voluntary basis. But the pace of progress is uneven, and therefore, in recent years, regulatory initiatives have increased substantially across jurisdictions. UNEP, UN Environment Program, has documented over 750 sustainable and green finance regulations established globally since the Paris Agreement was signed. These aim at, for example, increasing transparency of sustainability information, addressing greenwashing, strengthening climate-related risk management practices, and starting to mandate into transition planning. These developments are an important prerequisite for intensified net zero alignment across the financial system and the entire economy. Now, financial regulation can build on voluntary industry commitments to incentivize financing for Canada's economic transition towards a sound and sustainable economy. For instance, OSFI's new B15 climate risk management guidance is an important step in this direction. Reporting is needed to enhance the transparency, the credibility, and ultimately the effectiveness of net zero commitments across the economy, and ultimately to ensure the integrity of the transition. The development of international disclosure standards, including through the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, should be advanced as to ensure optimal allocation of capital to the net zero economy. Work by the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board to develop reporting standards aligned to the ISSB is very welcome in this context. Also, there is potential for a Canadian taxonomy to be used as a forward-looking tool to accelerate the net zero transition. Over 40 countries today have developed or are in the process of developing sustainability taxonomies. Europe already has 2 years of company reporting, whereby companies must disclose the share of their revenues, their capital expenditures, and their operating expenditures that are aligned with the EU taxonomy criteria. Results show that many sectors in the EU are investing heavily in the transition now, with CapEx alignment, so capital expenditures, consistently higher than revenues. Way out front in this are utilities, whose revenues are already 40% sustainability aligned, but they're investing almost 2/3, 63% of their CapEx in sustainability aligned assets. Real estate, as another example, is investing 27% of their CapEx in sustainability aligned building stock. It's important to highlight that finance cannot in itself fill a policy void, and therefore that financial regulation can only truly incentivize transition finance if mirrored by a whole of government approach to meaningful action and commitments in the real economy. In addition, voluntary and regulatory action must work hand in hand, giving financial institutions the necessary room to innovate and at the same time signaling towards stronger market uptake, learning, and ever-increasing ambition and innovation. Finally, the potential for regulatory fragmentation is serious, and the Canadian economy risks getting left behind if regulatory developments do not keep up with what's happening today in other regions. Without interoperable regulatory frameworks, sustainable finance can become disjointed and primarily compliance-driven, which is a missed opportunity for financial institutions to play their part in enabling the transition. Banks and investors need globally consistent regulatory standards and definitions in order to focus on the transition challenges ahead. As described, banks and other financial institutions have gone a long way to commit to and implement voluntary commitments. As far as possible, regulatory developments should be aligned with voluntary principles for greater consistency.
We're going to have to stop there.
Voluntary initiatives can provide leadership and best practice.
Yeah, we're going to have to stop there. Go to Mr. Miller now.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Chair and members. My name is Hugh Miller. I'm a sustainable finance analyst at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, where I work on climate and broader environmentally related financial risks. It is well recognized both internationally and in Canada that climate change and environmental issues pose risks to the financial system through physical and transition risk channels. Moreover, that the financial system will play a crucial role in financing the necessary activities to achieve regional and global decarbonization targets to mitigate future fiscal risks from climate change. However, there is a misalignment between the majority of climate-related financial risks will materialize and the necessary financing of low-carbon activities needs to occur. To meet regional and global net zero targets, significant and urgent upscaling of finance is necessary to fund the energy transition and the shift towards low-carbon technologies, with 125 to 140 billion per year needed for Canada to achieve its 2050 target. Conversely, the financial risks stemming from climate change and other environmental issues are only starting to materialize and may only become significantly material later on in the transition. Hence, there is a potential timing mismatch between the materialization of financial risks and the investment required to mitigate the risks from climate change. To help overcome the long time horizon of climate-related financial risks, we need to bring these risks forward into the time frame which impacts the investment decisions of market participants. This will require transitioning from a point-in-time assessment of climate risk towards a forward-looking assessment. Indeed, the Canadian financial system has already started to embark on a forward-looking assessment of these risks with the joint climate transition scenario analysis pilot project between the Bank of Canada and the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions. However, there are limitations to the currently available scenarios and their ability to analyze the potential risks from climate change, thereby limiting the ability of financial institutions to account for these risks in their decision-making functions. There are several actions which would advance the ability to assess the materiality of these forward-looking risks and capture them within time frames relevant for financial actors. First is the development of transition plan standards akin to those developed by the UK Transition Task Force, the UK TPT, as well as others, and the implementation of credible, comparable, and transparent transition plans to help financial market participants more accurately identify and manage climate-related financial risks. Financial institutions may incorporate forward-looking information, such as company-level emission targets, into their risk management functions. Moreover, these plans may provide input into the narrative of climate transition scenarios and help develop more realistic assumptions. Second is the clear classification system to identify both green and transitioning activities, by which finance can be clearly earmarked for in the form of taxonomy, which I'm aware that Canada is already in the process of developing. This should clearly outline the economic activities that qualify for financing earmarked with either a green or transition labels, whilst avoiding carbon lock-in. This should be complemented with clear guideline of how funds should be able to be classified as green based on definitions in the taxonomy. And then finally, environmental risks are broader than just climate change. Recently, we've seen several central banks, including the Dutch, French, Mexican, Brazilian, and Malaysian central banks, all publish an initial impact and dependency studies related to nature-related financial risks. The global economy, and by extension the financial system, is dependent upon ecosystem services provided by biodiversity and broader natural capital. Currently, we're seeing a rapid decline in biodiversity and natural capital, which may exacerbate the risk presented by climate change. Hence, to assess the potential impacts of climate, a broader scope is required to understand how different environmental risks may interact and magnify one another. An initial step for the Canadian financial system on this front would be to undertake a similar impacts and dependencies assessment, similar to the work done in other jurisdictions. Hence here, the OECD can help provide support for this technical analysis with the supervisory framework, which offers a 4-step guide to central banks and financial supervisors on how to technically assess nature-related financial risks. Thank you very much for your time and interest. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. We'll start our first round, the 6-minute round, with Mr. Deltel.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour à tous les collègues.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hello to all of our witnesses, to Mr. Miller and Mr. Usher. Welcome to this parliamentary committee. Before asking questions, I would like to tip my hat to the interpreters who work very hard. Our witnesses had a lot to say, and they spoke very quickly because they had very little time, and despite that, the interpreters did a very good job. We've been congratulating them and thanking them more often. I've wanted to do it for a very long time. Our witnesses have very important things to tell us. They did so very quickly, and our interpreters did a remarkable job.
Mr. Usher first. Mr. Usher, you talk about greenwashing. I would like to have some information from you. What is your definition of greenwashing? Can you give us some example of greenwashing and how it can be used by people to dodge their responsibilities?
Yeah. It's a very good question, and there's not a precise definition as today. I think if you take a consumer awareness view of greenwashing, is essentially selling a product based on some sort of something incorrect in what they're selling, and so there have been a couple of cases, a number of cases brought against companies, brought against investors, some by financial regulators, some by advertising regulators, which have been made accusations around mis-selling a product. And it's typically been products around how green we are, how net zero we are as a company or as a bank. But I think coming back to the transparency issue and also the need for a taxonomy, it's quite hard to have a clear definition of a greenwash unless you can have a definition essentially of transparency of what is sustainable versus what isn't. I hope that provides a partial answer.
Yes, obviously, as you said, it's not a very clear situation to address. But the point is that a lot of people are very upset when they see big meeting, in the middle of the desert with a lot of airplane and especially personal jet going there, and people saying, okay, they want to save the planet, but they use personal jet. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think it requires company leaders to be able to justify the decisions they make, how they spend their company's resources. And I think a lot of company executives are getting some pressure in this area. At the same time, I think air travel is considered a critical form of transport. In some jurisdictions, like in Europe, you're seeing some countries who are regulating short-haul flights should be replaced by trains, where that under a couple hours of distance. But I think overall the view is that an industry like the air industry needs to continue, and it's going to take longer to decarbonize. It's one of the industries where there's a talk of the need of carbon offsets because it's hard to totally switch over. But other industries can move more quickly to provide a balance.
Well, my personal thought on that is that as long as people will use that kind of travel and that kind of event and that kind of event, and they made their own choice, well, the industry will work on that. But this is another issue. Let me be more positive now. You talk about room to innovate. You said that during your testimony a few minutes ago. Talk to us about room to innovate. How can the companies and big emissioner can reduce their emission by innovation? Do you have some example to provide to us?
We have a booming industry. We have $1.8 trillion US that invested in the energy transition last year, investing in new business models, new manufacturing, new uses of technologies. And so this is a booming market. It's a very sizable part of the economy. And I think one of the questions for Canada, how much of that market are Canadian companies going to capture?
So do you think that to have fiscal incentive in new technologies to reduce emission is a good roadmap to follow?
That's part of the roadmap. And I think to my comments, a whole of government approach is what's required. Incentives are certainly useful, particularly for new technologies that are not yet proven. However, incentives on their own probably are not sufficient. We need transparency in the market, and we need a regulatory framework that provides certainty and a sense of direction that the private sector can invest against. Just to give one example, Japan, they have issued transition pathways for their main sectors, their main industries. So they give for the steel, for cement, for agriculture, for buildings, a view to the private sector is to say, this is how we believe this industry is going to decarbonize. That provides signals of certainty that allows investors to invest against.
What about the green energies like hydroelectricity, éolien, solaire, geothermal, nuclear? Do you think that we should fast-tracking those projects, giving green light to green energy?
Yes, I think few would question that. And most countries are doing that quite at scale. I'm not a specialist in the Canadian energy sector. I know there's a lot of hydro, but Canada should be a renewable energy superpower. It's hard to think that Europe has more renewable energy resources than Canada, but the scale of investment in renewable energies in Europe far outstrips. In the UK, in China, in India, all of these countries far outstrips the investment in Canada.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Madame Chatel now.
Merci,
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It is very interesting indeed, especially these most recent comments. We could be leaders, world leaders with regards to clean energies, apparently. Mr. Usher, Mr. Miller.
For your good work at the UN, at the OECD on this important study of finance, green finance and transition finance. Canadian companies are facing a growing competition for sustainable investment, and we need a robust climate information architecture in Canada. They should be based on data, disclosure, taxonomy. And what we learned, and especially the last panel said exactly that holding on taxonomy is holding on investment opportunities. And I note you mentioned that, Mr. Usher, we already 2 years behind Europe on that. You did mention in your introduction that we have taken some initiative. The OSFI B15 climate risk guidance is good. The CSSB aligning with the standard of the ISSB is a good thing, but it's not enough. And we should go further. Now, you mentioned that we risk being left behind in terms of capital attractivity in Canada. When is our last call to take effective action on disclosure and on taxonomy, Mr. Usher?
That's a challenging question. I think each last call means that there's less of the pie left for the economy, I think, to capture. I think what is clear is there is quite a large global universe looking to invest in this transition. And I think if Canada can put the systems in place and the transparency, it's more likely to attract those investors. And let me quote Larry Fink. He's the world's largest investor, the head of BlackRock. And if you read his annual letter this year, he's not preaching. He's not doing climate advocacy. His view is the world is changing. The energy transition is underway, and they're going to be a winner for their shareholders in delivering on that transition. And I think a lot of what we see from American investors and banks, they're global organizations, and even in specific jurisdictions, the signals might not be there, but globally they see that the trend is happening. And so I think it's for the Canadian economy to get the systems in place, it will attract investment.
Thank you very much. I'm turning now to Mr. Miller. First, welcome and congratulations on the OECD guidance on transition finance. I know you have been a key contributor to this work, and I must say it's very important for a country like Canada based on oil and gas. It's an energy and natural resources. It provides us the opportunity to contribute to or to attract investment in the transition area. But my question relates to your work on another very interesting area is your work on the dependence of the financial system on services provided by biodiversity and natural capital. How can the OECD help our government to technically assess nature-related financial risks?
Thank you very much for your question. On this front, yes. Biodiversity and nature-related financial risk
Monsieur
are
le
more
Président.
Excuse me, I must interrupt. The sound quality is not good enough, unfortunately, for for you to continue, Mr. Miller. What we're going to have to go to, I guess, Mr. Usher. In the meantime, I know that the technical team here is trying to reach you by phone. So perhaps,
yes, sorry.
So perhaps you could maybe they could try and solve the problem with you. But, Madame,
could we get that answer in writing, possibly?
Yes, that's a good idea. If we could get the answer in writing, that would be very, very helpful. Madame Châtel, je ne sais pas si vous voulez, si c'est une question qui.
I don't know, Ms. Châtel, if that question would be relevant to Mr. Usher.
Is also looking at how to factor in the transition finance and the green finance this issue of biodiversity risk and or loss of biodiversity risk and natural capital as well. So, Mr. Usher?
Yeah, absolutely. And I congratulate to Canada as being a key, the host of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was agreed last year. And one of the actions or several of the elements of that framework require or involve actions from the private sector. And part of it is around disclosure. And in the meantime, we have a new framework for nature finance-related nature disclosures, and a framework has been launched this year. And we do have 300 global companies are doing their first issuance this year. I'm not sure how many are Canadian, but the systems are building for companies to be able to be disclosing transparently on nature-related risks. It's not as developed as climate. It's more complicated than carbon, but quite a bit of progress is being made.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Usher, for Canadians who are listening to us today, can you explain how important it is, the transition finance for a country like Canada?
Yeah, it's very important. And to follow on from Hugh's comments, transition planning and having understanding the notion of transition finance, and this is where we need definitional work, and including a taxonomy is quite critical, particularly for resource-intensive economies like Canada's. It's not so much about what is green; it's what is greening. And part of the understanding is many actors in the economy, including those who are quite carbon intensive today, have to be part of the solution, have to drive the carbon out of the system within their business models. To do that, they need transition finance. Okay. And so a critical part of the taxonomy will be defining essentially what is transitioning.
Merci. Madame Posé.
Ms. Posé, thank you to our witnesses for being here. Mr. Usher, I'd like to ask you a question. When you appeared at the Senate around May 9th, you talked about strengthening transparency in order to understand where the risks are related to disclosure. Disclosure that is required is the starting point for all corporate banks, investors, in order to better understand their exposure to risks and what these risks are. So if there is no comparable methodology between jurisdictions, then Canadian banks are exposing themselves to risks. In Europe, the directive on sustainability applicable to 100,000 Canadian companies, including Bay Street banks, will be implemented shortly. Can you tell us more about the impact of the banking sector, of these on the Canadian banking sector?
If Canada does not put its own system is in place, it's going to be driven by the European system anyway, because for large companies who have activities in Europe, they are required to report in English, it's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD. And essentially, the Europeans are defining how they will report. If Canada comes in with an interoperable form of reporting, it allows the Canadian companies to get ready to do it, and essentially it'll work more efficiently. But we are getting, as I think was mentioned earlier, the carbon border adjustment, which is more an issue between countries about pricing economic activities. This is also being applied to corporates through this type of regulation. So once again, it calls out for the need for countries to work together in coming up with interoperable systems. And as you would know, corporates, the thing they hate most is to operate in multiple jurisdictions that have multiple reporting frameworks. That's why the work of the ISSB is so important. That's why CSSB aligning with ISSB is so critical. But that's only part of the puzzle.
Exact, tout à fait. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous brosser rapidement?
Could you perhaps tell us what are the best policies that have been implemented with regards to sustainable financing and the regulations worldwide?
I think this is a global trend. I mentioned 700 and more that have been regulations that have been established in the financial system. We do have central bank mandates vary. Some central banks have a very explicit sustainability as part of their mandate, and some do not. Canada does not. Some have an implicit mandate. Example of banks that have a mandate is actually Bank of England has an explicit mandate, and a number of others. So within the central banks and supervisors, you have some of them who do have regulatory setups that allow them to directly address these issues. I think in terms of taxonomy, as I mentioned, the Europeans are most advanced, but there are many taxonomies around the world that are developing. We're currently supporting the Brazilian government, many countries actually, and part of the effort is to make them interoperable. The European one starts because companies are already reporting. You can start to see how that transparency allows visibility on an economy in transition.
Monsieur le Président, il me reste combien de temps?
How much time do I have left, Mr. Chair? About 2 minutes. So we have 2 minutes, Mr. Usher. I have another question. You just talked about taxonomy, what's been happening in Brazil. I think that there are a lot of lobbying amongst advisory boards from fossil fuel companies. If the taxonomies are determined by stakeholders who continue to emit, how will we... have you seen this happen elsewhere? Companies who emit and who want to participate in determining what the taxonomy should be.
I'm not sure I understood, but maybe let me try to answer it. I think one of the things that's paramount is that the private sector needs to sense an inevitability of the direction of government. And I mentioned the Japanese example. When they see how the world is going, they will invest in helping realize that world. And I think that we're in the economies that are most successful today, the signals line up. I think the challenge in some economies is you get confusing signals. And then investors do not want to invest because the 20 or 30-year investment might not actually be allowed to operate. And so this can be applied both for high fossil assets and low energy, low carbon assets. I think that what's needed is the sense of inevitability about the transition, and the responsibility for that starts with government, but then of course involves corporates and the private sector.
15 seconds.
15 seconds, Madame Posey. You just have the time for an observation. Therefore, you are probably familiar with S243, which is being studied at the Senate. Do you support the project, yes or no? Yes.
Adequacy, we have questions over, but other elements we do.
Excellent, excellent. Madame Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And maybe just to follow up on that, can you talk a little bit about the areas that you support in that bill and what strengths you see?
I think the notion widely is that we need to start to understand how we align with a societal objective, essentially of the net zero transition. And I think elements of that proposed bill bring in more of the pieces that are required. A taxonomy and disclosure is a step, but there need to be responsibilities also within the corporation around governance, around expectation around transition planning, and essentially every company needs to be expected to put forward what they believe they're going to do as part of these changes which are underway. I think that the bill covers more elements, so it is a step forward. But as I mentioned, there are some concerns around capital weighting and adequacy, which we believe are not yet. There's not enough evidence yet maybe to put that into legislation.
And I'm curious, Canada's considering the role of natural gas in the taxonomy, and there are a number of organizations, experts who have raised concerns about including natural gas as transition or, sustainable under the taxonomy. Do you have concerns with including fossil fuels in the taxonomy?
It all depends on context. What is the natural gas replacing? And are there guardrails around that? Because I think for the coming years, there's an expectation that fossil fuels are required. But in 30 years from now, are they still required? And therefore, if you can put guardrails on investment out for how long an investment is expected to operate, potentially natural gas needs to be part of that transition. But every country will be different, and it's up to every country to figure out how to make that transition.
And if other countries exclude natural gas, is it in Canada's benefit to align more closely with, say, European Union countries who might be headed down that route?
A lot of it depends on what becomes a standard. And I'm not sure I can clearly answer the question. It really depends. If gas is replacing coal, that's probably a good thing. But if 30 years from now, gas shouldn't be operating because, wind can ease lower cost, then the question is, why are you putting the gas on the grid in a way that requires 30 years to pay it back? Maybe you only need 10 years. These types of discussions are what have come up in Europe because of the Ukraine war. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, some gas has been brought in, but most of the investment has been in renewables because at the end of the day, economics has played out, and wind and solar are the major sources of new capacity on the continent, even if certainly there has been some gas additions.
Yeah, and it seems like a kind of leapfrogging, and if we have the opportunity to invest in renewables that will be long-lasting, that seems like both a more climate-friendly but also a potentially long-term financially sustainable option. You talked a little bit about the progress in global standards and regional practices for climate-related disclosures. I'm just wondering if you could give us some more details about the recent progress that's happened.
Maybe I can talk about China a little bit, because I often hear China put up as the problem. I think the problem in China is they're a green superpower, and that should be a concern. And let me give you an order of magnitude. Canada built 2.3 gigawatts of new wind and solar last year. 2.3 gigawatts, it's about one nuclear reactor, smallish one. China built 300 gigawatts of wind and solar last year. China passed 50% of their new automobiles are new electric vehicles. China is moving very fast. And I think the question for the Canadian economy is how to keep up and compete with that change. Rather, their coal use is going down. It's not what has been purported. They're down to 40% of the electricity system today. The real challenge with China is how you compete with them, which is something that most companies have been dealing with for a long time. It's not an environmental question. It's a competitiveness one.
You have talked in the past about the good progress being made by the private sector, and it's not necessarily understood or reflected by governments, but that the private sector can't do it on their own. They need enabling frameworks and sound policies. Can you talk a bit more about how policymakers, regulators are or are not facilitating this integration, and how we can better support the transition to the sustainable economy?
Yeah. I think, you hear a lot about the IRA in the U.S. and how it's mobilized a lot of investment, and I think it has. It's been successful as an incentive. In Europe, it's more a whole of government approach. I think the difference is that in Europe, every corporate is realizing that they have to transition. In the U.S., it's only part of the economy, the green part, that's growing, but the rest of the economy has a lot of uncertainty. And so I think, as you say, the best examples we're seeing is where you combine incentives in new technology with transparency and markets investing across the whole economy and incentivized to do so.
Thank you. Mr. Miller, could you tell us a bit about the weather there in Paris where you are? I'm asking because we're trying to test the sound.
Yes, of course. Sorry. It's quite dark now because it's quarter to midnight, but it was a very nice and sunny, warm day in Paris, and with a small amount of showers, but being a Brit,
we're really happy to hear that, because unfortunately the sound quality still isn't sufficient. But again, we'll expect a written response to one of the questions, and thank you again. We'll go now to our second round, which is a four. Oui.
J'aimerais mentionner que
I'd like to mention something. All of the questions that we've asked to Mr. Usher, who is working for two organizations, but somewhat the same ones, are also good for Mr. Miller, because they do both work for different organizations that are all the questions go for both of you. So, Mr. Miller, if you can answer some of the questions in writing, if you do have some opinions you'd like to share, that'd be great. Mr. Miller, who is not participating, can add comments or answers to provide to some questions. He can do so by writing.
We can't exchange verbally. If there's anything you want to add in writing based on questions to Mr. Usher, or any thought based on any thought that you think is valuable to the committee, please send it in. Merci. Alors, on poursuit maintenant avec le deuxième tour.
We'll continue with the second round, which is 4 minutes and 2 minutes, respectively, so that we can end on time. Mr. Cram.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Okay, so I guess my questions will be for Mr. Usher, and I look forward to Mr. Miller's submissions in writing, assuming the chair doesn't approve a field trip to Paris in the near future. So, Mr. Usher, I wasn't quite clear from your opening statement. Like, what specific, particular, tangible public policy asks of the government of Canada are you looking for?
Taxonomy, and the next one would be an expectation around transition planning. And Hugh had mentioned that the UK Transition Task Force is considered sort of best practice. Those would be the two steps: an expectation that companies start to disclose based on a commonly agreed Canadian relevant, but also interoperability in terms of with other taxonomies, Europe, etc., to provide clarity, and then the expectation around providing a plan for how the company expects to deal with the changing climate.
And what does the taxonomy piece look like from your perspective?
Well, if we talk about the European one, and many have followed that, there are for each economic sector, there are limits set on essentially you have to emit below so many tons per whatever the measurable is per that sector, let's say per kilowatt hour, to be considered sustainable. But you have to do it with no significant harm. So essentially, you have to show as well that you are not creating environmental or social harms in other areas. So it's not to say we run after something which is really green, but also creates damages in another way. So that's basically the structure of the Europeans and most others as they follow. But then once again, it has to be specific to the local economic context. And as we said earlier, defining what is transitioning is a critical role for the Canadian taxonomy.
So what happens if a company is not considered sustainable?
Well, at this point, it's free open markets. And so nothing. It's up to the markets to decide. But if the markets start to believe that with the proper with the proper information, they understand that an industry is ready for disruption, they make decisions on that. And, the best example I would have is the Tesla effect. What happened to the value of automotive companies globally when one electric vehicle company all of a sudden became what most investors believed was the future of that industry. And every industry is going to go through or is already going through the Tesla effect of that sort.
Okay, so it's not considered sustainable in terms of environmental terms. It's considered sustainable in terms of economic terms. Is that correct?
Yes, and I think, as we think of environmental issues in a financially relevant way, it's basically, if you are polluting to the environment, the expectation, an investor will say, well, eventually that's going to be priced, that's going to be made illegal, your business is going to be outmoded. And so you need to properly monitor the impacts that you have, including on the environment, and how they will come back and affect you in a financial way.
Okay, so in terms of being made illegal, so that's something I hadn't heard before. So it's a way to anticipate like the next industry that the government will make illegal, and therefore investors should not be investing in this company if it's going to be made illegal before the investment is recouped? Is that
just say yes or no, Mr. Usher, please, because we're really running out of time.
Yeah.
Yes, I think
differentiation between physical risks, transition risks. What I'm talking about, transition risks, which is policy change, which is technological change, and which is consumer change. And any of those can lead to a devaluation of a business model.
Mr. Turnbull.
Thanks to both the witnesses, and sorry that one of them isn't able to participate fully, but Mr. Usher, good to see you, and thanks for being here. Thanks for all the work that you do globally, which is essential. I note that numerous speakers that I've heard speak about sustainable finance have said the strongest economies of the future will be the greenest economies. I think Canada is positioned to be a sort of superpower in leading the energy transition and greening our financial system is part of that. I would ask you, I think Canada is ready because we have legislative and regulatory pieces we've put in place, the Net Zero Accountability Act, carbon pricing, an oil and gas cap, clean electricity regulations, and others. We have investment tax credits, which are rolling out, and we have blended finance, which we've embraced. What we do not yet have is mandatory climate-related disclosures or a taxonomy in place. Can you speak to how important it is to create the right enabling conditions that those two pieces be put in place? You've mentioned them, but what's really at stake?
I think to my earlier comment, it's about creating the sense of inevitability that this transition is underway and is going to be, backed, supported by government, and that's what investors will invest against. And so, as you mentioned, you have world-leading carbon pricing. You have leaders, economic leaders in many areas. Mining, critical minerals is a key new industry that has to develop. So you have a lot of the resources, but the problem, what you lack is the transparency for investors, particularly international investors, to come in and see that this transition is underway and that it makes sense financially to invest in that transition. Other markets are ahead in that way.
And maybe I'm going to share my time with my colleague, Mr. Vancouverden, but I just wanted to ask you a quick follow-up, which was just in other jurisdictions around the world where they have put in place mandatory disclosure and taxonomy, are they able to compete better from your perspective? Maybe just a quick answer on that one.
Yeah, let's take the UK. Energy system, 2.3% relies on fossil fuels today. Largest source of power last year, wind. It bypassed gas. UK, the economy is similar in some ways. It has a high fossil fuel sector in terms of gas, but yet they are outperforming on a case-by-case basis, I think, with the Canadian economy.
Okay, thanks. Over to you, Adam.
Thanks, Mr. Usher. I have a really brief question. Are capital divestments in highly carbon-intensive and polluting sectors, when coupled with reallocations of those funds in innovative, green, sustainable companies, effective tools for lowering emissions?
I think the question is, we know the fossil fuel sector, price of oil is high, so they're very profitable today. And the question is, how are they reinvesting those profits? And only some companies, the ideal we would like to see is that they invest with their expertise in the transition. They have a lot of capacity to do that. We're not seeing as much of that as we would like. I guess that would be my
Can I intervene?
answer.
Like, what about when pension funds and large capital investment organizations divest?
So that's the divestment you're referring to. I think I would agree with other views that divestment as a vehicle it sends a signal, but in liquid capital markets, every divestor normally finds an investor. And so it makes more sense, at least initially, for an investor to engage with the company, engage with the governance, put directors on that they believe are going to be responsible to manage the company forward, and only as a last resort consider divesting from the company.
Thank you very much. Madame Posey.
Oui, alors, merci. Donc, Monsieur Usher.
Thank you. Mr. Usher. Here's one of the problems we have. Organizations are often taken over by private interests that want to dictate the rules for their own benefit. In other countries, is there anything put in place that makes sure that boards of directors and those who make investment decisions are not disproportionately composed of former leaders of fossil fuel industries?
Which expectations being set from some asset owners and others to basically expect that companies do not lobby against certain developments. It is definitely a concern. I think in terms of the governance of the Canadian oil and gas industry, I don't have too much to comment. I think companies need to be responsibly run, and investors in companies need to ensure that they have the boards and the oversight that will allow them to operate. And I think it's up to stakeholders to decide whether the investors are doing the right job in steering the companies they own, including in the oil and gas sector.
Donc, d'après vous, rapidement.
So, in your opinion, who do you think should be around the table?
I mean, coming back to your comments in terms of the bills under consideration, putting expectations on governance in terms of the role and the experience of boards, certainly I think there is some role in regulatory oversight of that. And there are a range of issues that are already expected of directors. There are liabilities on directors. This is an area of concern, for directors if they don't perform responsibly their functions.
Okay.
So I think that's an area where, yes, it does require further development responding to this issue.
Ms. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, just wondering, you had mentioned China. Are there other countries that you would want to highlight, either that we can learn lessons from, that we should be watching, or lessons of folks who are doing it right or doing it wrong?
This is a very dynamic space. Australia, it's a resource-intensive economy, has very large coal, and yet they've had a renewable energy revolution in just the last couple of years, partially driven by a very well-run pensions industry, so a lot of domestic investment, but also securing outside investment. And actually, Australian banks are global investors in the renewable energy industry. So that would be one example. But you can also go to Brazil, South Africa, Japan, which I mentioned, and Northern Europe and other parts of Europe, France. So there are many examples. And I think that's, in a global economy, this is not a trend that is situated in any one jurisdiction.
Thanks so much. I had a few questions for Mr. Miller, and I just maybe will say them in case you have time or interest in following up in writing. One of them was, I know the OECD has been working on biodiversity finance for over a decade, and in particular, incentives for conservation and the sustainable use of biodiversity. Recently, a government think tank published a report on biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, that these are, the second most likely future threat to Canada and the world in the coming years. So if you could write to committee and talk a little bit about how efforts by Canada's financial institutions to address biodiversity loss connect to efforts to address the climate crisis and climate change, how these are overlapping and intersecting. And then also...
No, we're done. Sorry, we're done. Mr. Cram.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Usher, I wonder if we could revisit the taxonomy and the logistics from the company's perspective. So how, if you have one factory that makes gas guzzling SUVs and another factory that makes bicycles, another factory that makes something else, how does each company go about getting its particular classification in the taxonomy system?
Well, it's a breakdown of based on industry classifications. NACE is one of there are some different classification systems, and the taxonomy has to choose which one they use, but they exist. And then essentially there is a threshold for each economic activity of what is considered sustainable. Most taxonomies have started with climate mitigation, but some of them are expanding to some other areas. And so it takes the bicycle manufacturer to go in and look at their activity and to say, are bicycles considered sustainable? They will be, I think, in most instances. An auto manufacturer will go in and say, okay, I need to sell autos below a certain percentage of carbon per mile driven to be considered sustainable. They probably have a mix of vehicles, and essentially they have to consider how are they going to apply to the system, to the taxonomy based on the mix that they have. But they have the expectation, if they want to secure investment, to say we probably need to transition our fleet over time to get into what's considered the sustainable form of automotive transport.
Okay, and so the companies have to approach the Bank of Canada to become classified, or the Bank of Canada is going to have inspectors with clipboards to come out to all these companies? How does that work?
But these companies already report, and so essentially, as part of their disclosures, they will be expected, and this is what's happening in Europe, and this is what's coming to Canadian companies that operate in Europe, that they do various disclosures as part of being in the financial markets, and this will add. There is a cost associated with such disclosures. It depends on the type of company, but it's true that there are activities involved in being able to do this. But essentially, I'm sorry if I can't give more detail of that's a rough description.
You have a high-level estimate of the costs associated with these disclosures?
No, I mean, companies already know how much they spend on disclosures, and there's a whole audit industry built up around financial audit. And so it's going to depend significantly on the type of company. And one of the requirements is, and someone mentioned, that SMEs are an important part of the Canadian economy. You typically have to think about, if you have initial legislation, probably you don't go for the SMEs to start with. You go with large companies who are more capable of doing this work. But over time, large companies source much of their product from small companies. And if they are expected to do Scope 3 disclosures, which is essentially carbon in the value chain, eventually they need to source that information from including SMEs. So it is a whole of a economy approach. But disclosures are something that the whole economy already does. This is adding in one more objective.
And this is for every company in the country?
Yes, sir. A brief answer, please, Mr. Usher.
Well, in Europe, when it started, it was 277 large companies, but now it's growing. It's the larger companies to start with, but that includes now 1,100 Canadian companies are going to have to be reporting to Europe because they operate there.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Mr. Vancouverden.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to also try to share my time. Could you kind of signal when I've got a minute and a half left or something?
Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to follow on that. What I've just heard is that Canadian companies who are operating in Europe are subject to disclosures and that sort of thing. And when they're operating here in Canada, I presume a lot of them probably do business in both places. They have different reporting requirements. That must be frustrating and annoying. So what would there be to lose? Like, why wouldn't Canada simply adopt the European Union's taxonomy for reporting on these things and then kind of incorporate some of our own assurances and priorities with respect to transition, given that we're a resource economy?
Quick answer, yes. Exactly what you've described, I think, would be the most logical and most efficient for the private sector way of doing it.
Okay, over to you, Ryan. Sorry.
Well, I note that I think there's 40 companies approximately in Canada that contribute roughly 90% of the emissions, and they're the ones, 40 of them, that are listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange. And so, in the UK, I note that they phased in disclosures, and I think it's the same in the EU over a number of years. Mr. Usher, could you maybe speak, about maybe carving out SMEs and what the rationale for that would be, and then how other jurisdictions have phased in disclosure to ensure that companies have some runway in order to adapt to new disclosure requirements?
Yeah, I think the general approach is you start with large companies and the emphasis on Scope 1 and 2, which is essentially what companies can directly measure, but with an expectation that because most of the emissions usually is Scope 3, let's say for an auto manufacturer, it's mostly people who use their cars that create emissions. It's not the building of the cars. So the expectation that they have a longer, several years on-ramp to get to Scope 3, at which time they need to understand the emissions that are embedded within their value chains. This is the approach that has been taken in Europe, I believe in the UK, and it seems to be the logical one. Of course, you need to be helping the parts of the economy to be able to get ready for these new regulations, and we need to support industries like audit industries who are able to come in and help companies to understand how they can disclose effectively.
Thank you. Could you also speak to the difference between just disclosures and transition plans? Because I think that there's a significant difference there, and you had mentioned taxonomy and transition planning as the response to another MP from the Conservative bench there. And I wanted to just clarify, you talked about disclosures and sort of mixed in transition plans, which I think are both important, but could you differentiate how transition plans go above and beyond? Thanks.
Yeah, very, very different, because disclosure doesn't require you to do anything. It just requires you to be transparent about your current business. It can also, as in the UK, be transparent on your CapEx, so how you're investing, which gives you some view on the future. But a transition plan is the expectation
about how you plan to transition to a future state. And so it's a more explicit business plan for change. Once again, it doesn't require you to say that you're going net zero, but the expectation is that they want you to be more explicit to say, well, what are the implications if you aren't going to decarbonize? How do you believe that your business is going to be affected? Like an auto company, if you stay with only oil and gas, internal combustion engine vehicles, do you believe 5-10 years from now you're still going to be in business?
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Merci à nos témoins. Merci à M. Miller.